"You're with me," said the Godfather, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "And I won't let anything happen to you." Adriana's heels clicked sharply against the marble floors of the high-end shopping mall as she made her way toward the exit. The soft glow of the chandeliers above illuminated the polished floors, giving the space an air of tranquility. Yet, there was an unease gnawing at her. The sharpness in the air seemed to come from more than just the brisk evening temperature. She quickened her pace, feeling eyes on her, but when she glanced around, all she saw were the calm, everyday shoppers. A sudden heavy presence behind her sent a shiver down her spine. She stiffened as she felt a shadow falling across her. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned. Standing before her was Antonio Vito, the Godfather himself. His tailored grey suit perfectly fitted his powerful frame, and his presence was as imposing as it was magnetic. He leaned in, his voice low and urgent as his fingers gripped her arm. "You're in danger," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. Adriana's pulse raced, the words hitting her like a thunderclap. What did he mean? Before she could react, Antonio's bodyguards flanked him, their sharp suits and caught expressions like a wall of stone. The world around her faded, the noise of the mall swallowed by the rising tension. With a quick tug, Antonio pulled her close, leading her down a darkened corridor. Adriana's mind raced. How had she become part of his dangerous world? What was she really walking into? Her quiet life was about to shatter, and nothing would ever be the same. Adriana's heart pounded in her chest as she stood frozen in the marble-tiled corridor of the shopping mall. The air, once light and filled with the hum of casual shoppers, now felt heavy, suffocating. She could feel the eyes of strangers on her, their gazes sharp and scrutinizing, as if the very walls of the mall had begun to close in. Her hands gripped the leather strap of her purse, her breath shallow. There was something wrong. Something she couldn't quite place but felt in the pit of her stomach. She tried to shake off the discomfort, but it only deepened as the sound of footsteps grew closer, too close. The echo of high heels and muffled shoes against the marble floor mixed with the rhythmic pounding in her ears. Her gaze darted around, but she saw nothing unusual, just the usual buzz of a high-end mall. Shop windows gleaming with luxurious displays. The footsteps stopped. She turned, her gaze locking with the man standing mere feet away from her. His appearance was imposing, his dark eyes focused intently on her. He was taller than most, wearing a perfectly tailored grey suit, his presence cutting through the crowd like a blade through silk. But it wasn't just his suit that made him stand out. It was the aura around him, cold, commanding, dangerous. Adriana's breath caught in her throat. "Can I help you?" she asked, the words barely escaping her lips as the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. He took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers, and before she could step back, his hand shot out, gripping her arm with a firm, almost possessive force. His touch was commanding, but there was an urgency to it. "You're in danger," he whispered low, his voice a dangerous mix of authority and concern. Adriana's pulse quickened. The words seemed surreal, like a scene from a thriller she'd once watched, but the tension in the air was all too real. Her mind raced, every instinct screaming at her to run, to scream, but her body refused to move. Her fingers trembled as they hovered over the pepper spray in her bag, but the man's eyes held her in place. He leaned in closer, his breath brushing her ear as his hand tightened on her arm. "Act natural," he urged, his voice like a quiet command. "Just keep walking with me, and don't look back." Before she could protest, he had already started to lead her away from the crowd, his hand never leaving her arm. She was aware of the movement around them, the shifting of bodyguards flanking him. Standing tall and silent, their black suits like a dark shield, protecting him. Adriana's mind struggled to make sense of it all. Who was this man? Why was he involved in her life? She barely knew him, yet everything about him screamed danger. The low murmur of the mall's ambiance became a distant hum as she moved forward, her steps automatically following his. The sudden change in her world, in the course of just a few seconds, left her feeling disoriented, like she had been swept into a current with no way of stopping it. She stole a glance at his face. His sharp features, the tattoos peeking out from the cuffs of his sleeves, the quiet confidence that made her stomach knot. "Stay close," he instructed, his grip still firm, leading her through the sleek halls. And just like that, Adriana's world, once safe and predictable, was forever altered. Adriana's mind raced as Antonio led her through the quiet, empty corridor. The luxury of the mall felt distant, the soft glow of its lights now almost suffocating. She couldn't understand what was happening, why he had approached her, why he was pulling her along without a word. His grip on her arm was firm but not threatening, yet she could feel the weight of something dark behind it, something that went beyond mere protection. They turned a corner, and suddenly they were in a secluded part of the mall. The crowds had thinned, the air colder here. Adriana's eyes darted nervously to the men behind them, silent, imposing figures who flanked Antonio like shadows. She tried to steady her breathing, but it felt like the walls were closing in, and she was no longer in control of her own fate. Antonio stopped in front of a closed door, his hand still around her arm, and pushed it open, leading them into a small office. The sound of the door clicking shut echoed through the room, trapping them in. It was sparsely furnished, a desk piled with paperwork and a few leather chairs scattered around. Adriana tried to pull back, but his grip tightened, stopping her. "You're not safe," Antonio said quietly, his voice grave, his gaze intense. His eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw something raw, something far from the impenetrable Godfather persona he had presented. This was no longer the confident, powerful man she had first encountered. This was a man who understood real danger. Adriana opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. Instead, she waited, her heart hammering in her chest. "I know you don't understand what's happening," Antonio continued, his voice softening slightly. "But there are people who want you dead." He paused, letting his words settle. "You've already stepped into a world that doesn't allow for innocence. People like me don't walk alone. And the people who are after me, they've now set their sights on you." Adriana shook her head, confusion and disbelief mingling on her face. "Me? Why would anyone want to hurt me?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know you." Antonio's expression darkened. He took a step closer, his intense gaze never leaving hers. "That's the problem. You're involved, Adriana, whether you know it or not." He ran a hand through his dark hair, the tension evident in his movements. "I have enemies, powerful ones, and now they've learned about you. They see you as a threat, a way to get to me." Adriana took a step back, her pulse quickening. "This is insane," she muttered under her breath, her thoughts scrambling. I don't belong here." Antonio's lips curved into a half smile, but it wasn't a comforting one. "No one belongs here, not in the world I come from. You've been living in a bubble, but you're in it now, whether you like it or not." The words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, Adriana felt the gravity of the situation she had stumbled into. The world she thought she knew, the one where she was in control, was gone. Antonio Vito's world had swallowed her whole, and she was left with nothing but questions and a growing sense of dread. As if reading her mind, Antonio added, "There's no going back, Adriana. Not now." Adriana's head was spinning as Antonio led her through the maze of corridors and private rooms in his hidden office complex. Each step deeper into the building felt like a step further away from the life she knew. The sleek, polished surfaces of the mall had given way to dimly lit hallways adorned with rich leather furniture, expensive paintings, and an air of opulence that couldn't hide the danger lurking beneath it. Everything here spoke of power and the price it demanded. She had no idea how long they had been walking, but she felt the weight of Antonio's presence next to her, a force that seemed to push everything else to the background. His bodyguards remained a few steps behind, silent and imposing, but Adriana couldn't stop focusing on him, the way he moved, the quiet confidence in every step. "Sit," Antonio said, gesturing toward a chair at the far side of the room as they entered a small, dark office. It was far more modest than the rest of the building, but the tension in the air made it feel like the center of a storm. Adriana hesitated, still trying to process everything he'd told her. The world he had described, the dangers, the enemies, all of it felt surreal, like something from a movie. She'd never asked to be part of this. She hadn't even known it existed, not like this, not so close to her. Yet there she was, a reluctant player in a game she didn't understand. Antonio sat across from her, his sharp eyes never leaving her face. "You wanted to know what this world is," he said, his voice low and steady, like he was laying down a fact that was unavoidable. "Let me show you." He reached over and grabbed a folder from his desk, sliding it across the table. The folder was thick, and the weight of it sent a shiver through her. She hesitated, but then opened it, her fingers trembling slightly as she flipped through the pages. Photos, documents, names, so many names. Some were crossed out, others highlighted in bright red ink. Adriana's mind struggled to process the cold, calculated nature of the contents. "These are the people who want me gone," Antonio continued, his tone colder now, his gaze fixed on her. "Not just random criminals, powerful figures, politicians, businessmen, others from my past who feel threatened by me. You've been dragged into this because of my enemies." Adriana's breath caught in her throat. The faces in the photographs were familiar. Faces from news reports, from public scandals. She'd heard of these people, but never in the context of violence or crime. To think they were all somehow connected to Antonio, to the dark world he had immersed himself in, was terrifying. "And they'll stop at nothing," Antonio added, his voice darkening. "They've been watching you. They'll use you to get to me, and they won't hesitate to hurt you." Adriana's stomach twisted. She felt the sudden, sharp sting of fear, real fear, for the first time since she had met Antonio. She had believed she could handle herself, that she could just walk away from this mess, but she was trapped now. The enemy was no longer a vague threat, but a tangible, terrifying force with faces she recognized. "And you?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "What do you do about it?" Antonio leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "I fight back. I always have." His voice softened, just a touch, as he added, "And I will protect you, Adriana, even if it means I have to destroy everything in my path." The words hung between them, heavy with promise and menace. Adriana sat back in her chair, the weight of the folder now a burden she wasn't sure she could carry. But as Antonio spoke, something inside her shifted. She wasn't just a bystander anymore. She was part of this world now, whether she liked it or not, and there was no turning back. Adriana had always prided herself on being independent, unshakable in her world of simple routines and clear boundaries. But in the days following her meeting with Antonio, everything she had built her life around felt like a distant memory, slipping away from her grasp. The tension between them grew every time they met. Antonio's world was a labyrinth of power and danger, and each day, Adriana found herself pulled deeper into it. The once calm and polished surface of her life was now cracked, exposing a darkness she had never even imagined. But it wasn't just the dangerous game Antonio was playing that left her unsettled. It was the way he seemed to watch her, like he knew something she didn't. She found herself waking up each morning with a growing unease. As much as she tried to shake it off, there was something magnetic about him. Something in the way his deep, dark eyes would meet hers, as though he could see right through her. It unsettled her. But in a way, it also fascinated her. Her role in all of this had become clear in the last few days. She was bait. She had been marked as an asset to be used against Antonio, a pawn in a game she hadn't chosen to play. His enemies had made it clear that they would stop at nothing to see him fall, and Adriana was their most effective weapon. Every time she stepped into his presence, the gravity of that fact weighed heavier on her. She had no choice but to move with him, whether she wanted to or not. But it was the way he treated her, always protective, always careful, that began to shift something in her. Adriana found herself spending more time with Antonio, both out of necessity and, to her surprise, desire. At first, it was always in the shadow of danger. Meetings in dimly lit rooms, whispering conversations in corners of high-end restaurants, the ever-present threat of his enemies lurking just outside. She had no illusions about what his world was. But as the days passed, as they navigated the complicated web of Mafia politics together, something unexpected began to form between them. He wasn't just the cold, calculating Godfather she'd initially assumed. Behind the hard exterior, she saw glimpses of something softer, moments when his guard would slip, when his eyes would soften, even if only for a brief second. The way he would carefully explain each move they made, as though he was teaching her the ropes of a dangerous world she'd never wanted to enter, spoke volumes about the man behind the power. One evening, after a particularly tense meeting with a rival faction, they stood side by side in a quiet corridor, the air thick with unsaid words. Antonio had been particularly cold throughout the discussion, his sharp commands echoing through the room as he negotiated terms with a dangerous group of men. But when they were alone, the tension between them shifted, becoming something more tangible. "You don't belong here," Antonio said softly, his voice carrying an unexpected sincerity. "I never wanted you to get dragged into this." Adriana's heart fluttered, a mix of confusion and something deeper rising within her. She wanted to push back, to remind him that she hadn't asked for any of this. But something in his eyes stopped her. She wasn't just a pawn in his world anymore. Somehow, without her realizing it, she had become part of his story. She didn't know what it meant, what would come next. But as Antonio's gaze lingered on her, she realized that the more she tried to resist the pull between them, the stronger it became. And in that moment, surrounded by shadows and danger, she understood that there was no going back. The game was no longer just his, it was theirs. The betrayal came like a storm, sudden and violent, ripping through the fragile peace that had settled between Adriana and Antonio. She had been learning, adapting to his world, and for a while she had almost convinced herself that she could manage it, that she could navigate the undercurrents of Mafia politics without being swept away. But that illusion shattered the moment the news reached them. Adriana sat in the back of the sleek black car, her fingers clenched tightly around the edge of the seat as Antonio's bodyguard, Marco, delivered the news with a grim face. The air inside the car was thick, suffocating, as the familiar hum of the engine felt distant and meaningless against the weight of what had just been revealed. Someone close to Antonio had betrayed him. A trusted ally had turned, feeding information to their enemies. And now, the game had changed. "Who?" Adriana asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her heart hammering in her chest. Marco glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his eyes hard. "We don't know yet, but it's someone inside. Someone Antonio trusted." The car came to a stop outside a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place Adriana had learned was part of Antonio's secret operations. She was used to the tension in his world, but this felt different, this felt personal. Antonio stepped out of the car, his expression colder than she had ever seen it. His jaw was clenched tight, his eyes narrowed with an anger that she knew well enough to recognize. The Godfather was no longer just a man of power. He was a man on the edge of losing everything. Adriana followed, unsure of what to do, but unable to stay behind. She knew that the moment she stepped into this world, she had crossed a point of no return. But now, standing in the shadows of the warehouse, she felt the weight of that choice more than ever. They entered the building, the sharp echo of their footsteps bouncing off the cold concrete walls. Antonio's bodyguards surrounded them, but it was Antonio who led the way, his presence commanding even in the face of betrayal. Adriana's heart raced as she watched him. This was the moment when everything would change. He had always been in control, but now She saw the vulnerability behind his gaze. For the first time, she wasn't sure if he could fix this, if there was anything left to save. Inside, the group of men waiting for them were quiet, their faces unreadable. Antonio's eyes scanned the room, cold and calculating, before he turned to Adriana. "You don't have to be here," he said, his voice low, almost pained. "I'll take care of this." But Adriana stood tall, her gaze steady as she met his. She couldn't look away now, not when she knew the stakes. She had already made her choice, and no matter how much she wanted to retreat into the safety of her old life, it was gone. "I'm staying," she said firmly. "What's the point of hiding when the real danger is here?" Antonio studied her for a moment, a mixture of admiration and concern in his eyes. Then, with a sharp nod, he turned back to the men. "Then stay close," he muttered. The battle was about to begin. And as the tension in the room thickened, Adriana knew there would be no turning back. She had crossed a line she could never uncross, and now she was part of Antonio's world, fully, irrevocably. The choice had been made. The fight had begun. The night had fallen silent, the world outside the warehouse holding its breath. Inside, however, the air was thick with anticipation and tension, as though everything had come to a head. Adriana stood near the entrance, her body rigid, eyes scanning the room where Antonio and his men were preparing for the confrontation. The betrayal that had rocked them all still lingered like a shadow in the air, and she could feel it, the uncertainty, the fear, and the ever-present danger that wrapped itself around them. Antonio moved with an easy confidence, his sharp eyes calculating, his jaw set tight with resolve. He was a man who thrived in this kind of chaos, but Adriana noticed the small tremor in his hand as he adjusted the collar of his jacket. It was a fleeting thing, barely perceptible, but it caught her attention. She had seen him face countless threats before, seen him issue orders without a second thought. But tonight something was different. There was a rawness in him, a vulnerability that he was doing everything in his power to keep hidden. Adriana stepped closer, her heartbeat quickening as she closed the distance between them. There was a part of her that wanted to retreat, to step back and leave the danger to the men who had trained for this life. But the other part, the one that had been slowly unraveling in his presence, refused to let her. She wasn't the same person who had walked into his world days ago. She was changing, adapting, and, in a way, becoming someone who could stand by him, face whatever came their way together. Antonio turned, his gaze locking onto hers, and for a moment, the chaos of the situation seemed to disappear. It was just them, caught in a fleeting, fragile moment of silence. He didn't speak right away, but his eyes held something unspoken, something that made her heart race faster, a flicker of something softer beneath the hard edges of the man she had come to know. "Are you sure about this?" His voice was low, a hint of concern threading through the usual calm authority. "You don't have to be here." Adriana took a steadying breath, her resolve solidifying. "I'm not running away anymore, Antonio. Not from you. Not from this." There was a brief pause, and then Antonio stepped forward, closing the distance between them until his body was a breath away from hers. The air between them was charged, heavy with everything unsaid, everything that had brought them to this point. His hand found hers. A simple gesture, but in that moment, it felt like more than just reassurance. It felt like a promise. Before she could say anything else, the sharp sound of gunfire shattered the stillness, and the world snapped back into focus. Instinctively, Antonio's arm shot out, pulling her to his chest, his body a shield between her and the danger. The room erupted into chaos as his men returned fire, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and the sound of men shouting orders. But through it all, Antonio held her tight, his hand gripping hers with fierce protection. "You're with me," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them, "and I won't let anything happen to you." In that moment, Adriana realized just how far she had fallen into his world. She wasn't just standing beside him anymore. She was in this with him, fighting back together against the threats that loomed. The danger was real, but so was the connection between them, and as the gunfire continued to echo through the room, Adriana knew there was no turning back. This was where her path had led, and she was ready to face whatever came next. The air was thick with tension as Adriana moved swiftly through the shadowed hallways of the warehouse. Her heart hammered in her chest, her breath coming in short, frantic bursts. The gunfire had stopped, but the danger had not passed. If anything, it felt closer now, an invisible threat that pressed in from all sides. Antonio had moved with his men to secure the area, but he'd made it clear that they were being hunted. His enemies were closing in, and they needed to get out, fast. Adriana's mind raced, the weight of the situation bearing down on her. She had never imagined that she would be thrust into this world, let alone be forced to fight her way out of it. But here she was, trapped in a deadly game, with the stakes higher than ever. The sounds of footsteps and hushed voices echoed through the hallways, and she could feel the walls closing in. Antonio had promised to protect her, but she knew that there was only so much he could do. This was her fight now, too. She had no choice but to rely on the skills she had learned since entering his world. The sharp instincts, the ability to stay calm under pressure, and the courage she had never known she possessed. "Move!" Antonio's voice was low and urgent as he appeared at the corner, his eyes scanning the hallway. He motioned for her to follow. His usually composed demeanor had been replaced by something darker, something desperate. But even in the midst of chaos, he still moved with purpose, with a power that both intimidated and inspired her. Adriana didn't hesitate. She knew that staying still was not an option. She followed him without question, her feet moving in sync with his as they navigated the maze of back rooms and hidden passages. The sounds of distant footsteps grew louder, and the echo of heavy boots on concrete reminded her that they weren't alone. But Antonio didn't look back, his focus entirely on their escape. They reached a metal door at the far end of the building, its frame dark and weathered from years of use. Antonio pushed it open, leading Adriana into the cool night air. The sky above them was clear, the moon casting a pale glow over the parking lot where his black SUV waited, its engine already running. Before they could make it to the vehicle, a burst of gunfire shattered the silence, the sharp crack of the shots reverberating in the night. Adriana's heart skipped a beat as she instinctively ducked, her body low to the ground. Antonio was already ahead of her, his movements fluid and quick as he drew his weapon, scanning the perimeter. "Get to the car!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Adriana didn't need to be told twice. She sprinted towards the SUV, her pulse racing, her mind focused on nothing but survival. The sound of more gunfire rang out, but she was already in the passenger seat, slamming the door behind her as Antonio jumped into the driver's side. The tires screeched as they pulled away, the engine roaring as they sped down the darkened streets. The city, once familiar and safe, now felt like a maze, its shadows hiding the dangers that were now following them. Adriana gripped the seat, her knuckles white as she tried to steady her breathing. Antonio glanced at her, his face hard, but there was a flicker of something softer in his eyes. "You're not just a bystander in this anymore, Adriana," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. "You've proven that tonight." Adriana didn't know if she could take the praise, not yet. The night had only just begun, and the real test was still ahead. But for the first time since she had met Antonio, she felt something stir within her. Something deeper than fear. It was determination. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was fighting back. The streets blurred past them as they disappeared into the night, their escape only the beginning of a much darker journey. The city was cloaked in darkness when they arrived at the abandoned warehouse, the place where it would all come to a head. Adriana could feel the weight of the night pressing down on her as they pulled up, the engine of Antonio's car cutting through the silence. The streetlights flickered weakly, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. Everything about this place screamed danger, and yet it felt like the inevitable conclusion to the chaos that had consumed her life since she met Antonio. They had been driving for hours, the tension in the car thick, neither of them speaking. Antonio had barely looked at her, his jaw set in a grim line as he navigated the darkened streets with practiced ease. She could see the strain in his movements, the way his fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly. She knew he wasn't just preparing for a confrontation with his enemies, he was preparing for the worst. The time for running had passed. This was no longer just about survival. It was about standing her ground. Adriana's heart pounded in her chest as they stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting at her skin. Antonio motioned for her to follow him as they approached the entrance of the warehouse, his eyes scanning the area with a vigilance that sent a chill down her spine. He was always in control, always the one with the answers, but tonight she could see the cracks in his armor. "Stay close," he said quietly, his voice rough, almost strained. "We don't know how many there are." She nodded, her breath steadying as she fell in line behind him. For the first time since she had been thrust into this world, she didn't feel like a helpless bystander. She wasn't just following Antonio, she was standing beside him. She had learned enough, seen enough, to know that this fight wasn't just his anymore. It was theirs, and if she was going to protect the life she'd built, she needed to be ready to fight for it. The door to the warehouse creaked open, revealing the dim interior. The air was thick with dust and the faint smell of oil and metal. Antonio's men were already in place, positioned strategically around the room, their eyes sharp and alert. It was clear this wasn't just a confrontation, it was a war. The enemy was already waiting for them. Figures stepped out of the shadows, their faces obscured by the dim light. Adriana's pulse quickened, and her hand instinctively went to her side, where she knew a gun was tucked in the waistband of her jeans. She had never used it, but tonight she wasn't just the victim in this story. She was part of it. Antonio's voice cut through the tension, cold and commanding. "You made a mistake coming here," he said, his tone dripping with menace. "This ends tonight." A man at the front of the group laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You think you can stop us, Antonio?" he sneered, his eyes narrowing. "You're outnumbered." Antonio stepped forward, his posture unwavering. "I'm never alone." The fight erupted in an instant. Gunshots rang out, the sharp staccato sound deafening in the confined space. Adriana moved without thinking, her training kicking in as she ducked behind a metal crate, her heart racing. She didn't hesitate. She had learned from Antonio how to fight, how to survive. As the chaos unfolded around her, Adriana's mind was clear, focused. She saw one of Antonio's men go down, blood splattering across the floor. The sight sent a jolt of fear through her, but she pushed it down, replacing it with resolve. She couldn't afford to be scared. Not now, not when everything was on the line. She moved forward, her gun steady in her hand, as she took out one of the enemies in a swift, calculated shot. The warehouse was a blur of motion, chaos, violence, and the sound of life hanging in the balance. She had stepped into this world, and now she was taking a stand. The final shot came from Antonio. The leader of the enemy group fell, his body slumping to the floor in a heap. The room fell silent, the weight of victory heavy in the air. Adriana lowered her gun, her body trembling from the adrenaline, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Antonio turned to her, his face unreadable. "You did well," he said, his voice low. Adriana didn't respond right away. She was still processing what had just happened, the reality of what she had become in this world. But as she looked into his eyes, she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't leaving it, not now, not ever. She had made her choice, and whatever came next, they would face it together. The days following the final confrontation felt like a blur, a haze of triumph and fear, the echoes of gunfire still ringing in her ears. Adriana couldn't remember the last time she'd truly felt calm. The world around her had shifted irrevocably, and she had been swept along with it, no longer just an observer, but an active participant in the world she had never imagined. The tension that had surrounded them in the warehouse was gone, but the danger still lingered in the shadows. It was as if every moment was a quiet waiting game, as though everything could change in an instant. Yet in the midst of all the chaos and uncertainty, there was a constant, a presence that anchored her. Antonio. She hadn't expected it to feel this way. She hadn't expected him to become anything more than a fleeting connection to this dangerous world she had been forced into. But now, as she sat across from him in his office, the weight of everything that had happened between them settled in her chest. There was no denying the way she felt. The connection between them was undeniable, and despite the danger, despite the chaos that seemed to swirl around them, it had grown into something she couldn't ignore. Antonio sat behind his desk, his usual collared demeanor softened by something deeper, something she hadn't seen before. He wasn't just the Godfather now. He was a man who had fought for everything he had, for everything he had built, and he had let her in. That was something no one had ever done before. She leaned back in her chair, the silence stretching between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that came after a storm had passed, when the dust began to settle, and everything felt oddly still. She didn't need to speak. Antonio already knew what was on her mind. "You don't have to stay," he said quietly, his voice softer than it had been in days. His eyes met hers, his gaze intense, as if he were trying to read her thoughts. "This world, it's not a place for people like you." Adriana looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest, and for the first time she saw the vulnerability in him that had always been hidden beneath the surface. "But I'm not leaving," she said, the words coming out stronger than she had expected. "I've already made my choice." Antonio's eyes softened, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Then you're not just here because of me," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You're here because you want to be." Adriana nodded, the weight of his words settling over her like a blanket, warm and comforting. She wasn't just part of this world now. She wasn't just a pawn in a game of power. She had chosen this life, and more importantly, she had chosen him. "I didn't think I could live in this world," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not as dark as I thought it would be. Not with you." Antonio stood and crossed the room toward her, his presence overwhelming as he stopped just in front of her. His hand reached out, gently cupping her face as he gazed down at her with an expression that spoke volumes. "I'll protect you," he said simply, and in his eyes she saw the truth of it. There was no pretension in him, no masks, just a man who had seen too much of the world's darkness and was willing to keep her safe from it. Adriana reached up, placing her hand over his, and for the first time since she had stepped into his world, she felt the weight of everything lift from her shoulders. There was no turning back. But in that moment, she didn't want to. This was her life now, and it was a life she would face by his side. Whatever the future held, they would face it together.